Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. This podcast includes solo episodes where I unpack scholarship in relation to computer science education and episodes where I interview a guest or multiple guests. Today's episode is an interview with Jesse Rathgeber, who is somebody that I met in grad school and have been friends and colleagues with ever since. Today's episode centers around two main ideas. One is on disability research and culture, and then the other is on the potential for connecting with the arts in CS education. So in this podcast, we discuss what educators can know about disability culture and research. We discuss what person first language is in comparison to identity first language. We also discuss some suggestions for combating ableism through anti-ableist practices, and how the arts and CS can come together and learn from each other. So this episode is not only great for CS educators in terms of learning more about disability culture and research, but it's also great for sharing with arts educators who might be interested in learning more about CS and the potential for its connections with the arts. Now, we mention many different publications, podcasts, and scholars throughout this particular episode, and I include direct links to all of those in the show notes, which you can find by clicking the link in the app that you're listening to this on, or by simply going to jaredoleary.com, which has nearly 100 podcast episodes and hundreds of resources relevant to CS educators and researchers, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is where I create a 100% free coding curriculum for Scratch and Scratch Junior. One quick disclaimer before we begin. Jesse mentions the product Soundwave, but actually meant to mention Soundbeam. So just FYI, that's the actual name of it. It's Soundbeam. With all that being said, we will now begin with an introduction by Jesse.
I'm Jesse Rathgeber. I'm an assistant professor at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. I specifically do music education classes around general music. I also have an assessment class. I'm originally from Central Illinois, so I'm back here at home. I used to be at James Madison University, where I helped co-found the Center for Inclusive Music Engagement. Prior to that, I was at Arizona State as a doc student with Jared O'Leary here.
So on your website, you describe yourself as a Maker-Educator-Researcher with like a hyphen in between each of those. I'm curious, can you tell me the story behind why you describe yourself that way?
The maker aspect, or at least the label, came probably around from time of being in Arizona, right? With the group of us who were there at the time, who were all tinkerers, right? That's what I would have called myself beforehand. From a young age, I tinkered. I just played around with stuff. I opened up toys and put them back together. My grandfather had a woodworking shop, and so I learned how to make stuff there and play around with things. I remember I actually was going and searching for this, but I remember when we first got our computer in 95 or 96, it was a Windows machine, as almost everyone who was getting a computer at the time, and I found out about Sound Editor. And so I remember as like a sixth grader playing around with this cheap microphone I bought at Office Max. I'm saying all these things that don't exist now. It makes me feel super old. I remember like singing into it and it recording, and you could adjust a couple different things on Sound Editor, but you could also incorporate other tracks. And I had just gotten a CD player at the same time, and all I had was the Pocahontas soundtrack and the Forrest Gump soundtrack. And so I made a whole bunch of weird, what would be called now like remixes using that. And then I remember redoing a lot of them when Audacity first came out, before it was a phishing spyware application as it is now. And writing songs, pretty much any chance to create was always where I did better at than other stuff. I was never very good at sitting and recreating stuff. For someone who became a music teacher, I had to have been the bane of the existence of my band and choir directors, because I just had so little interest in recreating stuff. I'd rather write my own song than anything like that. So when I went onto college and went on to teaching, I was constantly creating and tinkering with stuff. Especially when I was an elementary music teacher, I was building set design stuffs with students. I was eventually creating concerts with the students. So when I came to ASU and we're all studying about maker culture and what it meant to be a maker, that word finally made sense to me. It made sense in a way that there was a movement. There were other people who had that. I could never really explain it to my friends. The things I was really interested in wasn't necessarily, X, Y, and Z. It was kind of creating, messing around, things that would fit under maker. And I think that that aspect of my life, of that kind of make something new, or to in a bricolage kind of sense, draw from all the things you have, has just become central to me as a teacher, me as a researcher. I mean, my scholarship looks like a weird mix between phenomenology, case study, narrative work. Sometimes I do a lot of mixed method stuff. My teaching is kind of antagonistic to method and more about creating pedagogy that is in line with who you are and who the students are that you're working with. And so I just think that those terms, like I've always seen myself as a teacher, educator, facilitator. Sometimes I flip between those words depending on how I'm feeling in the moment, the needs of the space. The aspect of being a scholar or a researcher has just become quintessential part of who I have been. I mean, I write, but I do that because I'm interested. I've always been kind of curious anyway. It's almost as if like Maker would fit all those two other things quite easily in my mind, because to be a teacher, you often need to create. You often need to play around with and mess with what already exists. And to be a scholar, it's the same way. I mean, the scholars that I respect and that I constantly go back to have that same kind of zeal of playfulness and zeal of combining new ideas in different ways.
Yeah, very lifelong kindergarten approach, Mitch Resnick. And
very much so, yeah.
I'm curious, like, so you actually started dabbling in the intersections of the arts and CS before I ever even considered it. What made you go, I want to try out Scratch and create something that's music related?
There's another thing that happened kind of in early doctoral work, and I was antagonistic to it, to be completely honest. When, one of our mutual friends, Isaac Bickmore, and also Ryan Bledsoe, showed me Scratch and they were building video games, I was like, okay. And at that time, I could have grappled the idea of, okay, then we're going to make a soundtrack for it. But my brain wasn't quite ready with the notion that, no, this by itself could be a device, a musical experience. I had volunteered for 3 years at Higher Octave Healing in the rock band program, and we used a lot of colors to signify different fret positions. The guitars and keys had stickers on them. And I realized that I was having a really, really hard time saying the colors correctly and playing and also helping, because I was also playing guitar. And so I went home one night and I was like, I bet I could make a controller that I could like just program which colors it is and just move through. And I did. I made it out of like a spongy board, like a knee plate for a garden and big washers. And I took it in, and that's how I did it for a while. And then I started getting really interested in like, well, wonder if I could create something in Scratch that was interactive with the video aspect of it, because I'd been really interested in not only leap motions, but the big sound wave where you can move your hand through a field and it'll play different kinds of things. Well, sound waves are really expensive. I mean, like thousands of dollars, at least when I was looking into it last. And I was like, well, I wonder if I could create something that was a facsimile of that would work on Scratch. And so I created something that was just like, I think I called it sound field generator, that was just random sounds that would play over each other. And then learning that, I could easily have like students or community members change the sounds. I think the thing that really bit me, that got me super into all of this, was when I combined kind of the notion of having something that's interactive with the community and also something that's tangible, like something you can hold, was when a bunch of us created like a musical potluck.
Right, I remember that.
Yeah, we connected a bunch of spoons and pie plates to a Makey and then hooked it up to Ableton and made different sounds. And so when people were scooping up like strawberries out in front of the Union, they could hear these sounds. That was probably like the big aha moment for me, of like, this actually can be a part of who I am and who, contemporary students might want to do. Because it's this notion of like playing with this stuff. It's not necessarily learning how to use Makey or learning how to use Scratch and learning how to use Ableton for the purpose of learning those things, but it is to do something cool with it. Do something that made me and made others feel part of the musical experience. I mean, then just from there, it moved on to adaptive instruments. That's become kind of a core part of me as a teacher. Is we often do a lot of projects around creating adaptive instruments, either via case studies, which is my least favorite way of doing it, or with actual people, which is my absolute favorite way of doing it. But because the coding, the physical making of stuff becomes this labor of empathy rather than this intellectual pursuit of coding. You learn how to code through this trial, through this challenge.
I think your answer to that question is something that CS educators should share with their arts colleagues. There's a lot of great nuggets in there that I think would be very beneficial for like the, not just music education, but the arts as a whole, to see, this is how somebody who's from the arts applied and explored, etc. But I'm curious, in your explorations of like these intersections and whatnot, was there anything that surprised you or stood out that was unexpected?
Well, I mean, there's always lots of things unexpected, right? I mean, just like the pragmatics of day-to-day playing with stuff and like dealing with changing platforms, especially when you make tutorials for them and stuff like that. But the things that really stand out to me have been buy-in or pushback, to be completely honest, is there's a buy-in when you show people things that look really far outside of their normal day-to-day lives, right? So either people tend to, I mean, there's lots of perspectives, but the two perspectives that always stick out to me are the ones who want to buy into it immediately, and even if they don't grasp why they want to buy into it, they just want to try it out. Which, that's cool, but it's also problematic, right? Like, you have to think about, does this fit within the needs of the students there? Does it fit within the needs of you? How do you tinker with it? Or the people who are just all and out resistant. And I can see myself having maybe even embodied that as even someone who would have been considered more progressive as a music teacher. Had I experienced any of this stuff around coding, around computer science, integrated work earlier, I don't know how I would have grappled with it, right? Because it does, like, the stuff that I've done has really dismantled, in my mind, any sense of hierarchy of what music is supposed to sound like, because it's not necessarily about the end product as much as it is the doing of it. So, like, to me, it's less about recording someone performing on one of these things that we've created as it is someone actually creating something. And if it sounds bad to me, I don't really care, because if it makes sense to that person and it's meaningful to that person, that's pretty awesome. It's a great place to start. So yeah, those two perspectives are always interesting to me. And then you have people who do buy into it, but do the really, like, the thoughtful work, like what I tend to feel like here I am, I'm making the things that I would do sound like they're the right things. They're not. But the thing that makes sense, like being more thoughtful and critical. So I've got a colleague named Abby Blair, and Abby saw one of the earlier tech-based things that I had done at Illinois Music Educators Conference. And Abby is a teacher up in the Chicago suburbs, and she immediately wanted to apply some of these things. And she was really critical and thoughtful about how she integrated it. She has a very, like, ORF-inspired, but not ORF-beholden classroom. And she started finding ways to play around with makey-makeys and coding in her classrooms. And she would share things with me. Or anytime I would try something new, she'd be like, well, what about this? And she'd always add to it. Finding people who do that thing, the more critical kind of thing, is interesting. And I'm always stoked about that, because that adds a back and forth of, we created something, here, can I show you mine? Instead of the people who are just straight adopters, again, which is oftentimes you adopt something and you figure it out, and then you can unpack it. But, like, yeah, that's cool. Like, I showed you that 2 years ago. Like, I'd love to see something different. Show me how you're playing around with it. And maybe that's judgy on my part. It's definitely one of those things like that can be tricky to respond to, because you don't want to just be flippant, just like people who are really anti-adopting things. Other things that stand out to me, the collaborations that these things open up. So I was lucky enough that my second or third year at Country Meadows Elementary School in Long Grove, Illinois, which is where I had taught before I did my doctoral work, we had a brand new tech coach, and we were starting to move away from having a tech teacher into the coach position. And I had this wonderful guy named Bob Hanrahan, who is now a principal, actually, in the same district. And Bob hung out in my room a lot. When people weren't asking for coaching, he would just hang out in my room. In fact, the drum sets that are still in that room, I think, in that classroom, were his. He donated them. And Bob would, I would try to figure something out, and he'd be like, well, hold on one second. I think I can figure this out. We had once had these students who, and this is going a little bit further away into just tech in general, but we were doing recorders, right? And many people use recorder karate or other kinds of behavioralist things. And I did as well, but I made it so that it was unending belts, so people could just keep pushing. And I found that there's a lot less competition, but students didn't want to just test in class. They wanted to be able to send us stuff, which in 2011, that wasn't easy. And so I remember Bob, he was in there. He found out about 20 minutes after the student suggested it, we'd figured out a way of doing it. We did an 80s concert, and the art teacher really wanted to do something in the background of the concert, like some backgrounds that were not just like picture backgrounds, but like movement-based backgrounds. And so she decided she was going to do something with, is it Keith Haring? The artist from the 80s who did all the dance kind of form people, 80s and early 90s. So Bob found a way to have them animate these kinds of structures, and we created them in the background. And so the kids were in art class learning basic computer animation effects that they were connecting to their music stuff that we were doing. And then when the parents saw it, it was just it was this aha. But because Bob was there, Bob made a connection between myself and the art teacher to do something new that we would never have done. And I think that that's what I found consistently about exploring the kind of intersections of art and technology, or specifically computer science. It just opens up a lot of opportunities. Like a former colleague at JMU that he and I and Dave Stringham are trying to figure out a way of facilitating ukulele jams around the country asynchronously and allowing for social connections. Again, something that wouldn't have happened had I just stayed really well within my boundaries. Those are the things that probably stand out the most to me.
So I've only dabbled a little bit in like disabilities research and whatnot. I'm curious, because you have a much more extensive background and experience with it. What do you wish more people understood about disability research?
That it, just like disability itself and the experiences of disabled people / people with disabilities, is way more complicated than they probably assume. To that kind of end, like disability studies-based research, which is kind of where most of my stuff resides, is not about special education, and it's not about finding specific treatments or specific adaptations based on specific diagnoses. At least the stuff that I'm doing is a lot more about what is the experience of being disabled, to be in this identity and lived experience place. What does it mean to disable? How do we create disabling structures and institutions and practices that we may not intentionally want to be harmful? That notion that things are way more complex, I think, is probably the most important thing, because like I think about diagnoses. So many times, especially music educators, I can only speak from that because those are the students and the folks in the world that I tend to speak to, can get really wrapped up in worrying about the diagnosis rather than meeting the child, because the sense of need for medicalized expertise. Well, this person has Down syndrome, so I need to know all the things about Down syndrome. That's a part of some of this stuff, but like what Dylan is doing in class and who Dylan is wanting to be and Dylan's goals matter almost, actually I would easily say more. They matter significantly more than that diagnosis. Now, if that diagnosis matters to Dylan, then you need to understand the identity aspect of it. But just knowing that children with Down syndrome tend to have larger hearts, that doesn't do anything for you. And it can get people to move away from meeting people. It can cause teachers to see cases rather than people. Cases that they need to treat, whether it be treat through remediation or accommodations. It can just really quickly dissolve the real teacher-student relationship, or just human-human relationship that in a classroom, I think is essential to kind of the liberatory that Martine Erbach had talked about. And so many of the other people you've had on here have talked about that communication, that relationship. I think that sometimes a misunderstanding of the complexity of disability and an over-reliance on medicalized expertise can be the biggest impediment to having a real relationship. And everything for me falls from that relationship.
Yeah, that actually, I just had an aha moment where it was, I don't know what, a few years ago, you wrote a paper when you were describing the participants in it. It was the most beautiful narrative I've ever read in any paper, and I'm not just giving you that praise because you're here. Like, I genuinely mean that. Like, when I read through it, I was like, wow, they didn't just describe like, and Bob who has Down syndrome. It was, and Bob who is really interested in sports and loves to like sing rock music as loud as possible. Like, it was a very rich description, and it was very humanizing, which is often like the opposite of what tends to happen in disability research. It's very dehumanizing. Which, when you first started talking, the way that you phrased it was like disabled person / people with disabilities. Like, you were very careful with your phrasing of that. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that debate about the language around what I just mentioned.
Yeah, certainly. Well, number one, thank you. That really means a lot to hear that. Finding ways in general to describe people is way harder than I think anyone ever discusses.
Yep.
Right? I'm surprised I didn't say this when I was describing myself, but like, I'm bipolar. And so like that's a pretty important part of my identity. But that doesn't mean that I know all disabilities, right? And so like I'm describing people whose lived experiences and embodiment and mindment are not mine. So I can't know how they would say it. I can ask them, which is what I tend to do. And I tend to try to replicate that as much as possible. But to try to parse out the complexity of it is really important. Now, when I use disabled persons with disabilities, that's kind of my somewhat non-committal way of dealing with the person first versus identity first kind of controversy. So the person first language, which is now like the main language in educational law and educational policy, is the notion of like it's a person with a disability. So the person is always first. This thing falls through when you start using any other identity category, because we would never say like a person with female. I mean, you could say a person with female genitalia. That's really strange. Why would you need to know that? Or a person with blackness, or a person with African American heritage. Like, you don't often hear those kinds of things. So that falls apart in that. And that person first was actually originally suggested because people were using a lot of other really dehumanizing language, right? Like handicapped, cripples, and they were using these things as nouns instead of descriptors. So it became really common. In fact, somewhere in my dissertation, I found one of the professional journals that said, like, no, we're going to use this language from now on. The issue is that not everyone buys into that language, because many people in the disability studies or disability community, as a body of political ideology, political body, say, well, but that's kind of really, like, I don't carry my bipolar disorder around in a bag with me. Like, it's in me. It's me. I can't parse that out. And so a lot of them, especially moving out of the disability civil rights movement, really embrace the notion of identity based. So disabled, I'm a disabled person. And from a disability studies perspective, that means I'm a person who lives within a state where my body and mind somehow do not fit within the social expectations of who I am. And because of that, not who I am, but who people are. And because of that, I am disabled because the social setting is not set up for me. It keeps me out. When I was working on one of my first publications, actually the chapter I wrote with Adam Bell, we were trying to deal with this. And like, I'm really uncomfortable about telling anyone how they need to identify. I tend to use identity first. When I'm talking about myself or when I'm talking about theoretical things, I tend to use person first slightly when I'm talking educationally, although the students do know that I tend to bring this up, this notion of the parsing out of the different verbiage. But really, I default to whatever the person actually wants to be called, because it's so much easier just to ask them.
Yep.
So I tend to try to be really careful, at least once or twice, to use this big complex thing, because it does require people to slow down their thinking. And again, if we think about disability as more complex, it should require more thinking. And so I remember the first editors were first reading that, Adam and I, they're like, well, this is really long and complex to hit, even when you just use the letters. And it's like, that's the point. And I guess it's just the notion that, again, things are more complex than we realize. There isn't one settled term. And it's the worst thing that any of us can do, any person, is to, when someone is telling you how they want to be identified, is to go, well, that's not how you say that. It's different when you make a mistake, right? It's different when you use a different term because you messed up and you correct those mistakes, but it's completely different. Like if you go on Twitter, there are sometimes conversations, especially in the #actuallyautistic community, where there are people and there are scholars who are complaining to these people who have very specific lived experiences that they do not get to name their experience. And that to me is like, number one, hypocrisy. Number two, it is a definition of oppressiveness. That is, your worldview doesn't matter, mine does. My power matters, my perspective matters, my way of identifying you matters, my voice matters, my embodiment matters, my alignment matters. I consistently try to remind students and anyone I work with that this thing's way more complex. And so the first thing you should do is find out what people actually want to be called. It's become actually a lot easier. That conversation's less stressful since people have been using pronouns in their identification, because pronoun identification has forced people to slow down and force them to not center their subjectivity, and specifically, any kind of notion of binary subjectivity. So now students are like, oh yeah, why wouldn't you just ask them? But like, had you told me that as an undergrad, I would have been like, but what am I supposed to say before then? Such a concern of what do I say right now? And so much of it is things are way more complex than you realize. So how about you get to know the person before you make those decisions? And you're just always going to have to wait. Your comfort of being prepared does not trump the personhood of the people that you're working with.
And for a very concrete, like an example of like person first would be like a child with autism as opposed to saying an autistic child, etc. And what I am wondering out loud is there might be some people who would be listening and be like, yeah, but the intent is what matters. And what I'm trying to just say is I'm not trying to identify somebody. You're overanalyzing language, which, yes, I do that. Like, that was my dissertation. You also do that. You think very hard about your language. But there are terms within disability scholarship in particular that are important to know, like Tiny Timming or Supercrip. If you're unfamiliar with those, you should look them up. But there's also the hidden unconscious biases and problems or isms that come with the things that are said but are unsaid or implied. And so I'm curious if you can kind of unpack the label for that, which is ableism, and what the opposite of that is with anti-ableism.
For non-US listeners, disableism is often used in the UK specifically and other European nations. They mean similar things, but not exactly the same, but their difference would require way more than this podcast. But in some respects, you can understand them similarly. So Simi Linton, who in 1998 wrote a monumental book called Claiming Disability, talks a lot about disabled identity and also ableism. And Linton says, ableism includes the idea that a person's abilities or characteristics are determined by disability, or that people with disabilities as a group are inferior to non-disabled persons. So just like in race and racism, often when we think about racism, we think about the notion of white supremacy-based racism, which is really the thing that we're talking about, right? Where, one positionality is seen as higher than another, right? So like being white versus being black. In disability, it's similar. It's the non-disabled person being held above the disabled person. And this is a nice language thing. Like, I tend to use non-disabled because I don't like the word typical. I don't like the words normal. And I like to center marginalized positions as much as possible. And so saying non-disabled in this situation is Linton's way of pushing the center into disability and making people who are often seen as being on the inside become outsiders in this conversation. Another really great thing, I think this comes from Campbell, said, from the moment a child is born, she emerges into a world that she receives messages that to be disabled is to be less than, a world where disability may be tolerated, but in the final instance it is inherently negative. We are all, regardless of our subject positions, shaped and formed by the politics of ableism. This thing impacts all of us, and there's a notion of internalized ableism, which is often seen in conversations with disabled folk with disabilities who are almost policing each other or suggesting very non-disabled centric ideas onto others. The notion that, oh, you know what, if you can't do it, you shouldn't ask the world to accommodate you because the world's not going to do that, so just you have to deal with your own position. Even when the accommodation is like, what if we had ramps? What if we had ASL interpreters? Like, those are easy enough solutions that these shouldn't be discussions. But so if ableism is this negation of disability and personhood of folk with disabilities, anti-ableism is it's relatively new-ish. I know that there's only a few references to this specific word formation in the literature. It's essentially an intentional act of dismantling ableism. It is not being inclusive. In fact, in disability circles, the notion of being inclusive has often been seen as a good enough stance. But really what disabled folk and people with disabilities often want are not just inclusion, but full actualization. And that might require dismantling policies or physical situations or practices that put the non-disabled person as central and no other bodies and minds as being possible. What's important, though, is that anti-ableism, just like many of these antis, like anti-racism, does not swap the marginalized category with the powered category. That's not the intent of any of this stuff. It's meant to say that all these ways of being and perceiving and doing are valid, are valued, and can add to the complexity of human experience and non-human experience. So, for me, at least in my work, I've used a lot of notions by Martin Buber, philosopher, one of his, not necessarily students, but someone writing alongside his stuff named Kramer, who talked about the inclusive mindset, which is this notion of knowing people so well that their personhood is almost manifest in your consciousness so that you can really draw on complex thoughts rather than just your own assumptions. And so some of the things that I borrowed from Kramer through my dissertation talked about as being core of anti-ableist is this notion of building relationships first, right? I would never tell someone to not look at a IEP, but I can say that sometimes looking at an IEP and only concerning the IEP and never really developing a relationship with that person before making plans is really problematic, because it does dehumanize and it loses their chance to be part of your consciousness too. This notion of concrete representation, really having a deep sense of who we are and a deep sense of who people can be out in the community. So this could be just getting to know people really well and their eccentricities. It could be representing lots of things in your classroom. So if you're a music teacher, not just picking non-disabled folk to highlight, also encouraging reciprocity, this notion that we should have reciprocal relationships. All of us, it shouldn't just be a service or a caring to relationship, a one-directional thing. We should find ways of learning and drawing from each other, creating and sustaining openness so that we can actually say when problems are bothering us. Like in some respects, we often draw on other disability, like medicalized expertise, because we either don't know how to communicate with people or we feel really uncomfortable communicating. But this suggests that we need to kind of lose those feelings of discomfort to be actually open so that students can say, hold on, this is actually really tough for me and I can't do this now. Because that might not be fully realized in an IEP, right? Or, hold on, I don't want to do that. Like one of the things that students here at Augie caught on when we had our Disability Studies and Music Education Symposium was the notion that accommodations are great, but if they're forced upon someone, they're no more empowering than doing nothing sometimes. And so having this openness of being able to say no or yes. In my dissertation work, the number one theme of so many of the participants was, I just want to be able to self-accommodate. I want to personalize this myself. I want to create a new way of inputting this data. I want to find a new way of fingering that. I want to find a new way of representing this and allowing folks that personhood and that sense of agency. And then developing some sense of trust through that, right? Actually trusting each other when we say like, no, I'm just too tired for this. Isn't like a call of being laziness. It's just like, I'm fatigued and I have to deal with that. And then finally, just going back to this notion of concreteness is this more representation, right? Representing not only disabled people, but the processes that disabled folks and folks with disabilities might be using as normal, right? So like as a normal expression of human diversity. So that could be when we're talking about instruments, showing the accommodative versions of the instruments from the get-go, not making them some secret thing, or treating instruments that can do multiple things as being pretty cool. Like what if a student learned flute and all of a sudden couldn't use their mouth and jaw? What do? Well, I mean, like a digital input kind of thing is a different approach to it, but it still works if that's what they want to do. So showing that there's these different representations, these different approaches, different options. I think beyond those specific kinds of things, I think about the breadth of teachers really probably need to embrace a notion that disability is just more complex and identity is more complex than we often know. I think about Alex Lubit, who's a musicologist and composer at the University of Minnesota, wrote a book where he talks about the social confluence model of disability, which is the notion that our identity and our embodiedness, the extent to which it is seen as being disabled, changes radically with time, space, and activity. And to know that is, to me, is super freeing and also super challenging, because it makes me realize that when a kid comes into a classroom that I'm working in and they're struggling, I can't just brush it off as being perhaps their disability. Not that I would want to do that, but I have to notice that, okay, well, how were they doing in the last class? What was working in those last classes? What about this space? Or maybe in this space, they're feeling very empowered or actualized. How can I help other people realize and help this person be able to advocate for themselves? Those things to me are really central to breaking down ableism in the classroom. I think you can expand this beyond. I mean, being active at school board meetings, being active at any kind of place that policy is written in, and asking, how is disability included or not, and why? Looking into books and reading into the books and noticing when disability is left out and why it's left out, or why it's used, when and why it's used. Just becoming more critical. It doesn't necessarily mean like uh-oh, this movie has a really bad representation. I should never watch it, and I have to like beat myself up for watching it. Well, that's not the point. The point is to sit there and go, well, why is this? And why did I get such joy out of this? Why is this problematic? What can I do about it? Like just being conscious. In some respects, it's becoming more uncomfortable, right? Consistently becoming more uncomfortable with certainty. That is freeing in some respects and allows you to see the people around you and actually engage with the people around you, knowing that you don't have to have all the expertise.
If anti-ableist pedagogy is to ableism as anti-racist pedagogy is to racism, I see many great examples that you just gave for educators who want to learn more about this, or ways that they can explore anti-ableist practices. But getting to the idea of a person is not a label, especially not a medical label that is applied, how do you recommend that people understand and kind of uncover those ableist assumptions that they might have? So, for example, when I did the podcast with Andreas Stefik, we were talking about people without sight or blind individuals, and some of the ableist assumptions that would come with that would be, oh, well, they can't program because they can't see the screen. So how would they become a computer programmer? But how would you recommend people kind of uncover some of those ableist assumptions?
I mean, one of them is just to actually talk to people who've lived these experiences. So remembering that one person with disability is one person with disability, one person who's disabled is one person who's disabled. In the autistic community, there's this notion that if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. So no one can be the gatekeeper for an entire embodiment or diagnosis because these things don't function that way, right? But finding some people, if you are non-disabled, finding some disabled colleagues or friends to chat with. That would be some stuff, but also knowing that their job is not to teach you. So you have to, you should never go into a relationship with that intent. But having conversations, it's useful to look at research, look at who's talking about these things. I think about one of the ways I connected earlier on in my career with people who were thinking about similar-ish stuff was, number one, Joe Abramo published an article that said the social model of disability in Music Educators Journal. That told me that I could talk to Joe because I wasn't knowing that word was something. Or I read something and I realized that Adam Patrick Bell was someone that I could contact and actually talk to. And they would be able to point me in the right direction for resources. In some respects, that's the connection here, is finding resources.
Yeah.
If we're talking about specifically controllers or things that there is an identifiable creator, you can't talk to Sachs, right? You can't email him. He's been dead for a while. All right. But you can email the team at Apple that does GarageBand and ask them about their accessibility. You could ask them about how do screen readers work. I mean, you're going to develop your language and the things you're going to become more conscious about through engaging. I mean, you can buy or engage with really simple disability studies introductions. I've got one next to me because I'm using it in a project called Disability Studies, A Student's Guide by Colin Cameron. It's a really short kind of thing. Those things would give you ideas for where to go next. We live in a time when YouTube exists, and there are plenty of, if you type in disabled and something and critique, you could probably find it. So that's helpful to me. In the same kind of respect, even if it's not about your field, finding any time that disabled folk or folk with disabilities are talking about their lives, using that. So Alice Wong has a book called Disability Visibility, and it's stories of disabled folk. Read things like that. They're stories, which is really, really fun in some respects, right? Because you can actually get a sense of these things through lived experience rather than through dissected analysis. Use social media if that's the kind of person you are. And Twitter, hashtag actually autistic is a really helpful feed to me because it's often people talking about stuff that I would never have thought of because I don't live in that same kind of body or mind. I remember when cognitive behavioral therapy first was starting to become critiqued in more public spaces. Well, the actually autistic community have a lot to say about that. Finding that stuff out, I mean, you can just as simple as you're starting to grow your consciousness about things related to disability, take a word and search it in one of the social media feeds. Just see how that word comes up. See if there's been debate about it. Looking into professional and scholarly work is also really helpful. Whatever field you're in, I'm sure there's some kind of publication and it either has spoken about these things or not. And if it hasn't, then you should be one of those people who requests a commentary on it. If you are in computer science and you don't think that they've talked enough about disability studies-based notions of education, you need to be the one who asks for it. It's unexhaustible, the options you have, right? But I would also say, like, don't just limit yourself to things about disability, because things about race and disability are hyper-connected. Things about ethnicity and race and disability are hyper-connected, especially in education. So like if you look in the history of special education, a lot of it came about to deal with people whose body minds did not fit the English-speaking white expectations of schools, right? And that's not a critique on special educators that are out there. I don't want that to be seen as that, but we look at the history of things. Finding that out makes you go, okay, so if I study a little bit more about anti-racism, I bet I'm going to probably also get a broader understanding of anti-oppressive education.
Right.
Which, I mean, at least in my experience, that's how it's been. Like when I look at this, I think about race and then I think about other intersections of oppression. And it makes me go, okay, what would the analog be for disability in this situation? Okay, well, what that would look like if I plugged it into computer science. I think the last little thing is just have conversations with your colleagues about this stuff.
Yep.
And don't let it get pushed off. It's not okay to have a conversation about disability that is just that kid has ADHD and they're really hyper and that's all we're going to talk about disability. No, like talk about accessibility and equity for disabled folk and folk with disability. Like talk about how can this thing be perceived and manipulated visually? How can it be done orally? How can it be done kinesthetically? How can it be done just about any other ways that we perceive and can articulate information? And it's not good enough to just do one. You need to have multiple. And so talking to your colleagues about ways to create multiple lines of access does a lot for everyone. It does a lot for broad notion of diversity of thinking and embodiment. It does a lot about helping you think through multiplicity of teaching strategies, and it starts good conversations.
Yeah, and for anyone who's interested, so some people that you could look into for CS education might be like Andreas Stefik, who I mentioned the podcast that I did with him, but also like Richard Ladner, Maya Israel, Todd Lash. So these are all individuals who are discussing this, and I'll include some more in the show notes so you can all check that out. So thinking broadly back to where we were like at the start of this conversation. So like your intersections and experiences with CS and the arts is an interesting topic to explore. What I'm curious is if you could share some of the ideas of what practitioners and scholars, etc., in both fields could kind of learn from each other.
The worst thing I've found in my life is when I put up a wall to cordon off certain kinds of thinking or certain kinds of doing, or even person itself. It impoverishes me as much as it also impoverishes the experience around us. So, like, I know that many arts educators can feel marginalized in school spaces. There are actual reasons for that, and there are imagined reasons for that. We won't get into that right here. I've seen arts educators be leery of computer science educators because often there may be a concern that they're going to take over the time and space that I have. Well, my thought is, number one, don't be antagonistic because it's not that person's choice. It's not like if Bob, if he had been a tech teacher specifically teaching coding, he and I, we couldn't have been antagonistic to each other. Well, we could have been, but there would be no reason for it because he like literally doing the job he's been hired to do. It's a more of an administrative kind of thing. So having a conversation with an administrator, I would say just finding any chance to collaborate is going to give you chances to make, from artistic standpoint, maybe new ways to express artistic ideas, right? So even if you're thinking from a formalist kind of standpoint, right? Like the elements, like there are ways to express the elements of art that are also coded. And also like I think about things as codes anymore. I mean, like I remember I didn't mention this, but like as a little kid when we first got the internet, gosh, that seems so long ago. I went to Barnes & Noble and bought this huge book of HTML code because to make a website, you had to know some kind of HTML code. And I remember coding my first website, and I think it was a review of The Phantom Menace, which, of course, I'd have to be that guy, right? But I now think about what are the codes, or at least the repetitions in art that exist because of that structure, right? That's more of a metaphorical notion, but I also think you could do that same kind of metaphorical way of understanding on computer science. I mean, like, I know there is a notion of the elegant code. I've heard people talk about that. Well, what makes it elegant, right? Like, it's often elegant because it doesn't have extra stuff, right? It has just its bare essentials. It also has this certain kind of different aesthetic. Like, why not discuss things that are about computers using the same artistic phrases and metaphors that we use? I mean, those are ways that we can share language and then broaden our language. Other things I think they would get out of these kind of collaborations or these intersections. I mean, for me, there's also this notion of just less boredom, of repeating the same thing over and over again. And there's a worry of like, oh, I'm now going to have to learn all this stuff. It's like, well, I mean, if you're collaborating with a colleague, like they're going to probably take care of that stuff. And you're probably going to learn incidentally about this stuff. So like, you need to not worry about that, because that's that whole like expert mindset thing that I know that you have quite a theoretic conversation around, of like, we need to bust down this notion that we can be experts in everything, or that experts in general. But like, just noticing, like, I've got some ideas that I can bring and they can have some ideas. To me, though, probably the biggest thing is that we're talking about kids' education in their lives, right? And humans' education in their lives, right? We owe it, I think, to the people that we get the opportunity to get paid to work with, to show them the way that the things fit together, instead of just showing these isolated disciplines and showing them the ways that they can prep for XYZ job or XYZ next class. Like, I remember leaving like 6th grade and thinking I knew a whole lot of stuff. I mean, I didn't think specifically about all this stuff, but I don't actually remember knowing how any of it fit together. Like, I didn't know how writing an essay fit together with reading a book about the Civil War. Those didn't make sense to me, why I was learning these things together, or how music class fit into any of this stuff. Or even when we had computer class, like, we played a whole lot of Oregon Trail and Otter Lake. I learned how to use the hardware. But like, if we can, even these two areas that are seen to be somehow so disparate or so disconnected, if we can come together and show how these things make holistic things in people's lives, then just about everyone else in the school can too. And like, often, at least for me, my partnerships with other areas, art and computer science, as well as in the writing the teachers were teaching, my music class became the center of the school for months on end when we were doing big projects. It's not because of power that was cool. It was cool because there were kids coming to school and working chunks of their day to do something they thought was really neat. And that all came together. Any chance that we can give more opportunities for that, we should go for.
You've mentioned many things that could be holding back either individuals or like the field, etc., or at very least things that we need to consider. But if I were to able to grant you a magic wand and you could change one thing, what would that thing be that you would want to change?
Well, I'm going to go radical then. I would probably dissolve discipline-specific classes. I would create an education experience where students could create their own projects, where teachers could create projects, where we would learn all the same, somewhat like the basics that we need to learn, that you would be expected to learn so that you could carry on, but that isn't just going to music class for 30 minutes every other day or every other week. You know, it's actually that like music could ingrained into freaking everything, right? Like arts could be integrated into everything. If we are doing things in these broad project-based things, I also get to collaborate with my colleagues in a way that I never was able to. I mean, like, we were a very collaborative school. But I could imagine, had that not been the case, how isolated I would have felt at the end of the hallway. And getting rid of some of these things, I think, would change a lot. Number one, it would change a lot of the chances for collaboration because we have it. Going back to disability, it would require accommodation to be the central aspect that teachers do, is accommodating the needs and the specific interest of students. If it's in a project-based space where everyone's operating that way, you can't not do that, because there isn't a specific objective criteria of what this success is in this. That has some problems, and there's definitely things that would have to be figured out. But to me, that would probably be the biggest thing. I think that sometimes disciplinary boundaries do way more to separate people, not just ideas, but people and ways of doing things, than they are often worth.
And if that sounds too radical for people, I'll include a link to the Sudbury schools, which is a model that does that. And like literally the kindergartners get a vote on like budget concerns with the same amount of weight as the so-called staff members, etc. So like I highly recommend checking it out. I'll make sure to include a link to that. So it's not as radical as that sounds.
It's possible. It's such a possible kind of thing. Even if that was like the inspirational goal, any work that you did between where we're at and there, I think would make a school more interesting, engaging than it might otherwise.
Yeah. So you had mentioned like some experiences with bipolar. I have mentioned on this podcast my experiences with depression and suicidality and whatnot. And then you and I one-on-one have had many conversations about mental health over the years. I'm curious if you could share some of the advice or things that you do to try and stave off like the burnout that can come with working in education, especially working as a researcher in education.
The thing that I probably should have learned earlier on is that having some way to separate my work thoughts, even if it's not just their work life, like, and it's never going to be 100% balanced all the time. In fact, that's not how balance works, right? But it's the notion of being conscious of having time to unplug and having time to be fully plugged in and not necessarily being halfway. During the summer right now, I've made it that generally most afternoons I don't do a lot of stuff. I'm now on the ramp up towards school, so I'm doing more afternoon kind of things, but I needed that. During the school year, I've done a lot better about, unless I have an required thing at 7 o'clock, everything shuts off. I don't check email anymore. That's it. I tell the students that as well. And I tell them, like, hey, if something's due the next day, you're probably not going to want to email me the night it's due. And I put it in the syllabi just so that they all know. Like, and it's all as much just me trying to model for them that you need to do this. You need to have some unplugging time. I have a couple activities that I really love doing that I can get completely engrossed in that will force me to not think about most educational or most of my professional work. Number one is rebuilding guitars and like messing around with their wiring. I have a Strat in the other room that I have rewired 4 times in the last week and a half, and it still doesn't play. And I don't know what it is, but when I'm working on it, hours pass. And I listen to a podcast, and not once do I think about other stuff. I've gotten really deep back into my vinyl collection. Well, my vinyl, I'm searching specific things. I'm trying to not be a big collector. I have tons of stuff, specific albums. So I'll come down here, and I'm lucky I have an office space that's kind of nice and cool. Our chinchillas are down here, and I'll just sit and listen to an album, and I do the whole album just to kind of take a break. Those things have been really, really important. And I think the last one is I'm trying to differentiate. Like when I'm at work, I do work stuff. So like when I'm at my school office, which I can't right now, they're renovating it. But like that's where I get all my school work done. So this space that we're talking, I actually don't do a ton of school work at anymore because I try to do it at work. The notion of separation, having something else to do, and also having kind of a musical thing to do has been helpful. I mean, our dogs are always like, they make you do something, right? And then I also have recently invested in a hammock. So when it's not rainy, I go out and lay in the hammock for an hour or so just to kind of clear my mind.
Yeah, sounds nice.
Yeah, it has been. It's been one of the best investments. I mean, the fact that I have multiple things to share now, I think when you and I met, I would not have had anything that I could have shared that would have been my relaxation because I didn't value relaxation. And then I had a mental breakdown. So, that's what happens. I'm glad that you asked that because like I try really hard in my classes anymore, even freshmen, because I teach a freshman intro to college class. I really try to impress upon them that also the notion of valuing rest, and that rest is as central to getting things done as just trying to work on it. And so like we talk about like, okay, you have this essay to write. And how do you break it up? Okay, well, I've got 3 hours to write it right now. I was like, no. That's good, but like, you might try that, but your brain might not work that way. And some people's do, but you should test out a couple different ways of approaching it. Because I think having these conversations is important. It does break some of the stigma of talking about mental health. It also breaks the stigma of feeling like you're selfish for taking care of yourself. Like I often felt like I should be doing this, I should be doing that, I should be doing that. But the only person who thought I should be doing that was my brain that didn't want me to relax.
I don't know about for you, but at least for me, especially in the doctoral program, there were so many high achievers in the program that even if one person was taking a break, I would not be looking at that break. I'd be looking at the other person who happened to not be taking a break at that time. So it always just felt like, well, somebody out there is working really hard, so I also need to be doing that.
Yep, it's almost that fear of missing out, but in working. There's some right now, I see so many people who are like, well, I just published this. Like, that's great for them. That's really great for them. I used to go like, oh, that sucks that I didn't do that. And maybe that's one of the mental health secrets, is knowing how to celebrate others and not to see their success as somehow tied to your failure.
All right, so here's a quote that I like to review. It's from Lao Tzu. So it's, people don't get tired of enjoying and praising one who, not competing, has in all the world no competitor. And that is a quote that like really sits with me and kind of resonates with what you were saying.
That's great.
So what do you wish there was more research on that could inform your own practices?
I mean, I would love to see more research in music ed and in computer science, in many educational fields that is informed by disability studies rather than just being informed by special education. And I don't want to set up an inherent binary between those two things, but they look at things differently. And I don't think that we see the full nature of stuff by looking at one. So I'd love to see more things. I'd also just love to see these more intersectional or interactive approaches to disability to be used more often. I mean, we often still, I said social model and there's medical model, but like that binary is really problematic and has been pretty much like discussed to death at this in disability studies, and everyone has their own model. I mentioned Alex Lubitz's social confluence approach, which sees ability, disability, even identity changed at the moment of the space-time encounter and activity. I think about Petra Kupper's rhizomatic approach to disability that sees disability in a very intersectional kind of way that is never repeatable and always becoming. And then also Tom Shakespeare's critical realist approach that he talked about, whereas the medical model said my body disables me and social model says society disables me, he says both my body and society can disable me. That is interesting. I think more things in those worlds would be helpful. And then finally, I think more pedagogical work that is based off the narratives, first-person narratives of disabled folk with disabilities. I think that we're beyond where an expert needs to explain what to do, and we're at a good point where a good scholar can sit down with someone and craft something together. And that person doesn't necessarily need the scholar, but the scholar probably most likely needs that person. So like maybe for reciprocity's sake, we do things where we are teaching each other and rather than just going and collecting data. But like, yeah, I'd love to see a thing about coding from a blind coder. Like, I'd love to hear a conversation about that. Not necessarily about the accommodations they need, but what they do.
Right.
We don't need to sit and ask about accommodations from someone who's doing it right now. Just ask them how they're doing it. That will show you their approach that is probably accommodative, but I think more things like that would be very helpful, and it wouldn't have to be speculative. Some of the wider disability theory stuff seems speculative when you don't have as many people sharing firsthand accounts.
Yeah, definitely plus one everything that you just said. The only thing that I might add from a meta level is it would be nice if disability was like a demographic category that was normalized and discussed in research, because it's often, oh, well, here's the gender, here's the race, here's the et cetera of the population we were studying, but it does not mention disability at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the trick would be, and this is actually something I would love to see as it is, being disabled demographically is different than being disabled in a lived experience way. It's the same thing for race, gender, ethnicity. Our social categories, our social identities are often run slightly different than our personal identities and our embodiment and mind.
We could do a whole podcast episode on socially situated identities, but that's for another time.
Yes.
Is there anything that you're working on right now that you could use some assistance with?
Right now, not so much. Pretty soon I will be. I'm going to be working with a couple larger institutions as a disability and inclusion consultant on some large technology-based, computer science-adjacent projects. I'll definitely share them your way whenever things come up. I'm pretty excited about those, but I can't even guess at what the things that would arise. But I'm very excited to actually be in a large group, and hopefully these grants get funded, because we just need to do these cool, big, massive things where we're integrating a lot of different approaches and having people who can speak to different issues of representation and oppression.
Do you have questions for the field or for myself?
I guess I have two kind of broad questions you could really replace any discipline or field here, but like, how can and have disabled persons or persons with disabilities impacted computer science, specifically computer science pedagogy? I think if someone can't identify the way that those things are, it might be something to have a conversation with themselves, right? Disabled people are everywhere. Persons with disabilities are impacting lots of fields. So it might behoove someone who is a CS teacher or a scholar to know the ways that disabled people with disabilities have impacted their work. And I also think about how might centering disability reframe computer science practices and assumptions. Like if we centered the notion of disabled embodiment and alignment as the main position, what things would be identified as problematic? What things would be identified as really probably not necessary because they're really holding up people doing important work? And that could be anywhere from words to literal approaches to the metaphors we use. I think those two things are the questions I ask myself related to almost any area that I'm in, because it does help me rethink things, right? I mean, like if I don't know, I'm doing something and I don't know how disabled folk with disabilities have impacted that, I probably should know.
Yep.
And if I don't think about what it might do to centering, then I need to do that thought experiment. And it can also be done more scholarly based, right? Like a full-on critique.
I like that. So the last question then is, where might people go to connect with you in the organizations that you work with?
I could be found on Facebook and Twitter, Jesse Rathgeber. You also could contact me at email, which is jesserathgeber at augustana.edu. So it's Jesse Rathgeber at augustana.edu. You also might follow the James Madison University Center for Inclusive Music Engagement, something that I helped found and still am tangentially connected to. Work that Dave Stringham, who's the director there, is doing is just really phenomenal. And finally, you just might keep the Disability Studies in Music Education Symposium, as well as the Disability Studies in Music Education Working Group on your list of things to search out. We're about to start this working group, and I'm really excited about it, but trying to be more coordinated about bringing disability studies into the field of music education and hopefully being able to share beyond that. I think about like our colleague who we've brought up a couple times, Adam Patrick Bell. His life is connected to technology and computer science almost equally as it is to music. And so I'm certain that his contribution through this would probably have some useful things for folks in the CS field.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. I hope you enjoyed listening to this interview, and I hope you learned something new about disability culture in particular, something we haven't talked about enough on this particular podcast. Friendly reminder that the show notes includes many links to the resources, the scholars, and the publications that we mentioned in this particular episode, so make sure you check that out at jaredoleary.com. If you'd be so kind, please consider sharing this with somebody who'd be interested in learning more about disability culture and research, or even the connections with arts and CS. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all are staying safe and are having a wonderful week.